Good morning, everybody. So we saw an example from GSK. Let's have a look at 12 other companies. If I manage to open this presentation, it's not in presenter mode, but it's now. So we really wanted to dig into the awareness and the understanding of USP 665 and also what actions companies are undertaking to meet the requirements of the letter. Really something like a status quo, where do we stand? Therefore, we asked a lot of questions, which for the sake of time, I'm not going to read out here out loud, as we will be going through each question with the answers. So let's jump into the survey. Currently, ELSIE contains 37 members, pharmaceutical companies all over the world, and 12 companies participated in this survey. Our first question was a quite light one. Do you feel confident that you could implement the chapters as written by May 1st, 2026? That is, do you fully understand the requirements and what it takes to meet them? Funny enough, half-half, 50% said yes, 25% no, I don't think so, and the others said, well, maybe. So those who said no or maybe said, well, we are not really clear on the impact on our commercial products. We are not quite clear on the extent of requirements to one, some, or all dosage forms listed in FDA. And there were also other reasons given. Pretty much a lot of uncertainty and unclarity on some details. So those details can be, there are gaps in knowledge of all plastic processing materials in production. I work personally at Octapharma with these things, so I can assure you this is really quite tricky if you have been running a production for 10 years to map all of that. Most people do not have NVR or UV absorbance data on their plastic components. There is a lack of extractable studies based on the USP 665 protocol, which is really quite special, and felt or perceived impossibility to re-extract thousands of articles according to this USP 665 protocol. Furthermore, testing requirements for low-risk components. Is 665 compliance required? Does that even exist? Can we still use our own risk assessments to categorize components according to risk? Or do we need to follow 1665, which is strictly speaking not mandatory, right? Then there is a challenge in low-risk components for tests that are perceived as not given much added value like NVR and UV absorbance. Significant amount of interpretation required to meet USP 665, speaking again about certain details. Unclear if scientific rationales would be accepted by the authorities. We just spoke about this. And unclarity on the development phase for development products. So there are some discrepancies on risk dimensions between requirements in 665 and 1665. It doesn't quite match always if you really exercise it. And difficulties to access the data from suppliers. Here we have a very clear answer. All companies would be willing to collaborate on this chapter if there was another chance to make some changes. We also asked, well, so do you think there are any acceptance limits for NVR and UV absorbance? Sorry for the mistake here. And most people think there are not. Some people say we don't know, and some say, oh yes, there are. Those who said yes, there is an acceptance criterion referred to the USP 6611, but of course it's unclear if this limit is also perceived by 665 or not. There is also a limit in food contact, as you probably are aware of 10 milligram per square decimeter, but again, very unclear if this plays any role for 665. Are you now screening all your materials for NVR and UV absorbance at your company if you don't have the data already, we asked. Most people said clearly, no, we don't. Some do. Do you get these data from your suppliers, we asked. Partially was the most given answer. Many do not receive any data. Some companies do receive data. It's very, very specific. So if you specifically ask your supplier for the data, you may or you may not get it. Some supply it automatically in their E&L packages, others don't. You never know. So there are regulatory dossiers, regulatory support files, material qualification dossiers, validation guides. You can get the data, but not necessarily always. It depends very much on the supplier and also on the component. Some companies said, we don't know if all the different suppliers provide this data. In case the data is missing and the risk is significant, normally we perform the test ourselves. Others said, we get the data from only very few companies, if the data is available, so the answers repeat themselves. We asked the same questions as we did for NVR, for UV absorbance, and again, most people don't know about any acceptance limits for UV absorbance. Again, the 6611 value is referred to here, but it's unclear if this is applicable to 665. So we ask people if they are now testing all their materials for UV absorbance. Clearly, they don't. And if they get it from the suppliers, the answers are actually the same as for NVR. It really depends and on the supplier, on the material. If you proactively ask, it depends. The next question we asked was, does your company have data from suppliers to perform the 1665 risk assessment? For example, if you are familiar with the 1665 risk assessment, there is a term called material reactivity, and therefore you need to know how many additives your polymer contains, or if it contains bonding solvents, and if it's sterilized. Most people said, well, partially, yes and no. It again depends on the supplier. Some risk assessments are limited due to this information. So some suppliers say it's impossible for us to say how much additives are contained. Other suppliers do provide the data. It really depends. Mostly we can say it's very difficult to get the data on large scale. One company answered 3 suppliers provided the data, others don't, and some say it's impossible. And some suppliers don't even have the data because their supply chain is so complex that at the end of the day, you just don't know what's in there. So does your company consider USP 1665 at all, or do you have your own risk assessment in place? Most companies have a combination of both, an own risk assessment, considering some elements of 1665. Only very few companies really consider 1665 risk assessment, and some companies don't at all. These are the answers that were given by the companies specifically. So mostly it's some sort of mélange. So we consider some aspects from 1665, but rarely somebody is really applying the 1665 risk assessment at the company. Furthermore, we asked, does your company strictly extract according to the USP 665 protocol, which I would like to highlight once again is very specific? So most people don't, some people do. Basically, the extraction times and solvents are based on the formulation matrix of the drug product and the target product profile at most companies. Companies do consider their drug products and process conditions. So for instance, I always like to pull out the tubing example where 665 wants you to extract your tubing for, 7 days, something very harsh, I would say. When you're using this tubing for 10 minutes, it may not make much sense. Some companies say that they apply a mixture of USP 665 and BPOC, depending on the type of material, but not all time periods may be applied. Some companies do use C3 solution, but only for a few materials. And so most companies, one way or another, tailor their extractable studies based on their process conditions and based on their drug products. However, some elements of USP 665 protocol are considered. Then we asked, well, so what does your company actually do with the data for risk class low, moderate, and high? For low risk, most people basically just collect the data, and only few companies assess them. We don't know how, but they do. And for medium and high risk, people collect and assess the data, which makes sense. To go a bit more into detail, people said, well, internal risk assessment is conducted and then further steps are taken based on the risk levels. We remember that many people have some sort of, well, own risk assessment only considering parts of the 1665. So low risk material assumptions is for some just to have sufficient supplier data. The USP 665 specifically states actually that all the data has to be interpreted, which brings us back to the question, how do I do it for UV absorbance or NVR? For many companies, low risk means that no data collection and assessment is performed at all because there is low risk. Some companies say we only assess the data from materials that are used in process steps where there is no further clearance, which does not strictly correlate to the risk according to 1665. NVR and UV data are non-compound specific, so there is limited use, some companies said. Chromatographical data would be evaluated for potential toxicological impact. And some companies said, well, for low risk, we would not pay for the data, but would use vendor statements. We then asked companies, are the risk mitigation steps that are clearly outlined in 1665 understood and applied by your company? As we found those quite interesting. So most companies said yes or partially, and only few said no. Companies mentioned that the risk mitigation steps are understood, but their risk assessment would not necessarily apply those. Somebody said, well, risk dimensions as provided in the USP are included as part of the overall risk assessment for an internal policy. USP 1665 suggestions are considered in internal assessment instructions. Understood but not complete. We had the example of surface area to volume ratio. Yeah. Then dilution is used but not the clinical use, which is practically considered difficult to implement. Maybe at this stage I would like to highlight that the USP 1665 does offer you a risk mitigation if the dosage is, for example, only a single dose at a very small volume, then you may apply a risk mitigation. Another company mentioned, well, we understand, but the risk mitigation steps are performed according to our product-specific knowledge, which may make sense. And yeah, an inventory is also being made to get an overview of the used materials and the available data, said somebody else. We asked also if companies already have been challenged by regulatory authorities with regards to USP 665 and 1665, and the majority said yes, we have. So during submission of new processing materials by FDA and Health Canada, some companies said we are often asked to comply with 665, 1665. Again, 1665 would not be strictly applicable, even if our assessments are more rigorous or include Leachables testing. And another company said routinely, which is quite astonishing, given that we are expecting this chapter to be official only in May 2026. We also asked, does your company agree with the revisions recently being made to 665, or do you have any additional comment or concern on this update? Here we received a lot of answers. So mostly this NVR UV absorbance test on materials is questioned, if we may summarize this. So for most companies, it's considered a non-added value testing. Nobody knows if there is any limit or not. What do you do with the data? To get it, it's also not so easy. You need, to perform the test. Routine analysis with MS and more quantitative analysis has been generally requested from the agency rather than NVR or UV absorbance. So somebody said we don't really see the rationale or benefit of doing NVR and UV absorbance. Also, the chapter tells you how to extract the materials. It says nothing about the assessment of the data. However, without assessment, the data is pretty much meaningless, as it always is. Some companies do not agree to low-risk testing in general, including performing NVR or UV. Another comment was made on the solvents depicted in 665 and the extraction conditions. So some companies do not agree. 7 and 21 days of extraction with various solvents seem to be far too much. I probably understand where they are coming from. If you have a contact time of 30 minutes, what's the point of extracting for 21 days, right? So it's taking a lot of time and does not provide much information. Then there is also a concern of extracting with 50% ethanol at 40 degrees Celsius. For some materials, this may be just too aggressive, and the extraction time points are not always representative for the manufacturing process. Another big topic that was addressed when we asked was consistency. So the more you study 665 and 1665, you ask yourself certain questions and you may have a lack of understanding here and there. For instance, 665 states that guidance is given in 1665 for the interpretation of UV and NVR, but nothing is actually provided there. In 665, you have 5 dimensions of risks given as mandatory for the risk assessment, while 1665 lists 4. Furthermore, there is a lack of clarity on the scope and related impact for early development products and implementation timelines. So it's all not so clear. Another topic was the testing approach. So the major concern of some companies is to test all the small contact materials like O-rings, gaskets, and whatever you have in there, which, speaking of from Octapharma's perspective, I fully understand. Speaking on behalf of ELSIE, I just would like to highlight this. Then also a general topic. So there are companies who said we actually completely agree with the contents of 665 and 1665, and our procedures predate 665 but are slightly different, and they don't have yet adopted the nomenclature, but plan to do it in the future. Some companies mentioned that they did not modify their internal procedures in a meaningful way to comply with 665. And many companies really wished more guidance regarding the requirements for biocompatibility for process equipment. So our summary from this nice little survey, again 12 companies that provided some answers, is actually USP 665 and 1665 are not perfectly clear to people. And it's not just a single person, there must be something. Most companies do, however, prepare one way or another to be compliant to 665, if one may call it so. The meaningfulness of UV absorbance and NVR is highly questioned. Most suppliers only partially provide the data you would need for the risk assessment according to 1665, especially UV absorbance, NVR, but also amount of additives, bonding chemicals, and so on. Most companies somehow consider 1665 in their risk assessment, but not fully. Most companies do not strictly extract according to the USP 665 protocol, which will be then a funny thing if you're inspected. You show your extractables data, but it was not performed according to USP 665. Will this be a finding? How will this be addressed? That's very unclear. Because we're lacking some sort of, how is there a strict, either you do it that way or no way, or is there something in between? Companies also said that despite not yet in place, health authorities have already requested USP 665 and 1665 data. On behalf of Octapharma, I can confirm that this is true. then there are still concerns regarding USP 665 and some comments on necessary modifications and clarifications. So overall, I would also agree with my previous speakers that we're somewhere on the way there, but still a lot of questions, uncertainties, and especially a lot of work to do for the companies.